At the top of Stevens Pass in Washington state, two trains sat trapped for the better part of a week, boxed in by a blizzard that refused to let up. In the middle of the night, on the 1st of March, 1910, a wall of snow broke loose above them and swept both trains and part of the town around them, 150 feet down into a canyon. 96 people died. It's still the deadliest avalanche in American history, but 3 days later, 600 miles north, on a different railroad, in a different country, it happened again. Go back further than that morning, because the mountain didn't ambush anyone. The Great Northern Railway had pushed its transcontinental line through the Cascades in the 1890s, and everyone who worked the route knew Stevens Pass buried itself in snow every winter. James Hill had built that railroad without a single acre of federal land grant, which meant an idle train was money leaking out of the company, so the schedule kept moving, even when the weather said it shouldn't. By 1910, wooden snow sheds already covered some of the worst stretches along the pass, roofed tunnels that let a slide pass harmlessly over the tracks instead of onto them. The slope above the little depot town of Wellington had no shed at all, and it had recently been logged and burned over, which stripped away the very trees that would have held the snowpack in place. Nobody built a shed for a slope nobody had flagged as the dangerous one. Snow started falling there in late February and did not stop. Within days, the storm had dumped feet of it, and two trains, a passenger local and a mail train, sat stuck at Wellington waiting for the rotary plows to punch a way through. Cascade snow isn't the light, dry powder people picture. It falls wet and heavy off the Pacific, and railroad crews at the time had already nicknamed the stuff Cascade Cement for how it packed. The plows kept jamming on trees and rock buried inside the drifts. Telegraph lines came down, so word couldn't even get out to the rest of the country. Passengers played cards, sang, wrote letters they couldn't send. For almost a week, they waited there, listening to smaller slides come down around them, close enough to hear, never quite reaching the tracks. Then, on the last night of February, the weather flipped from freezing to warm rain, and lightning cracked over the ridge above the station. Just after midnight, everything above the trains let go at once. A wall of snow tore down Windy Mountain, picked up both trains and part of the town, and dropped them 150 feet into the canyon below, burying the wreckage under dozens of feet of snow and broken timber. No warning whistle, no time to run. Rescuers dug through the wreckage for weeks, digging by hand in a canyon so remote that supplies had to be hauled in on foot. And it took until late July, 21 weeks after the slide, to recover every body. 96 people never made it out. 35 of them were passengers, and the rest wore Great Northern uniforms. Only 23 people walked away from it. It remains the deadliest avalanche this country has ever recorded. Here's what turned Wellington from one company's tragedy into an industry-wide reckoning. 3 days later, 600 miles north, a nearly identical horror played out on the Canadian Pacific Railway at Rogers Pass in British Columbia. A crew was out clearing an earlier slide off the tracks when a second avalanche broke loose above them and buried the entire work crew where they stood. No one heard it coming over the wind. Every man on that crew died, except one member of the engine crew. 58 men were gone. It's still the worst avalanche disaster in Canadian history. 2 different railroads, 2 different countries, 2 disasters 4 days apart, and both of them exposed the same problem. These mountain lines had been engineered to survive a normal winter. Nobody had engineered them to survive the winter that actually happened. The first fix wasn't a new idea. Snow sheds had existed since the 1880s, and after that week, railroads on both sides of the border built a lot more of them. Mile after mile of timber roof bolted straight over the rails through the worst avalanche paths. They worked, in the sense that a slide could bury the roof completely and a train underneath would just keep rolling through the dark. But wood rots, wood burns, and a shed only protects the exact stretch of track it covers. Rogers Pass alone eventually had more than 30 of them strung along about 6.5 kilometers of line, and it still hadn't been enough, because the avalanche that killed those 58 men caught a work crew standing in the open. Between sheds, clearing snow, the railroad had no way to keep off the tracks in the first place. Some of those old sheds are still standing today, slowly rotting into the forest, a wooden fossil record of how far the engineering had to come. A roof over the rails could stop a slide from landing on a train. It could not stop the mountain from letting go, and it could not protect anyone still standing outside when it did. So the railroads tried something bigger. If you couldn't keep the mountain off the tracks, you could put the tracks somewhere the mountain simply couldn't reach, underneath it. The Canadian Pacific started boring the 8-kilometre Connaught Tunnel under Rogers Pass in 1913, and when it opened in 1916, trains stopped crossing the exposed summit altogether. They dropped underground, ran beneath the mountain in the dark, and came out the other side of the danger zone entirely. The old surface route, sheds and all, was abandoned within a year. Decades later, in 1988, the railroad bored a second tunnel nearly 15 kilometres long, Mount Macdonald, mostly to add capacity, but it kept the same logic. When a mountain kills that many of your own workers, you stop routing trains across its face and start routing them through its base. Stevens Pass got a version of the same medicine, just slower. Within months of the disaster, Great Northern poured a concrete snow shed nearly half a mile long directly over the section where the trains had stood, and quietly renamed the town from Wellington to Tye, hoping travellers would stop associating the name with the dead. But concrete over the same exposed grade only bought time. In 1929, the railroad finished a brand new Cascade Tunnel, almost 8 miles long, bored lower on the mountain and well clear of the slide paths that had buried 96 people 19 years earlier. The old grade through Tye was simply left behind. What's left of it is a hiking trail now, past crumbling shed walls nobody maintains anymore. The lesson both railroads learned an ocean apart was almost embarrassingly direct. Stop fighting an avalanche on the surface. Put the train somewhere it physically cannot reach. But you can't tunnel under every mountain a railroad has to cross. A tunnel that long costs a fortune and takes years to bore, and plenty of exposed grades simply don't carry enough traffic to justify digging a new mountain out from under a whole railroad. This isn't a problem unique to 2 lines in North America, either. Alpine railroads through Switzerland and Austria live with the exact same slopes and lean on the same layered answer everywhere the ground won't allow a tunnel. Sheds where the money justifies it, forests deliberately left standing above the grade because a healthy stand of trees anchors snow in place better than almost anything engineers can pour, and constant monitoring of every slope in between. Some stretches still run exposed, in the open air, under slopes that load up with snow every winter and eventually have to let go on their own schedule. For those stretches, engineers went a different direction entirely. If a slope is going to avalanche eventually anyway, why not choose exactly when? At Rogers Pass today, the Canadian military runs an operation built entirely around that idea. Gun crews station 105mm howitzers at roughly 17 fixed positions along the corridor, aimed at more than 250 pre-registered targets across over 100 avalanche paths. When the snowpack builds to a dangerous level, they close the highway and rail line, fire explosive shells into the trigger zones, and bring the slope down on purpose at a chosen hour, with nobody standing underneath it. The program fires over 1,500 rounds most years, 1,500 deliberate detonations every winter, just to keep a mountain from choosing its own moment. Where guns can't get a clean angle, crews use remotely triggered gas exploders bolted into the starting zones, or drop explosive charges from helicopters. And above the paths that fire the most often, Parks Canada has strung one of the largest avalanche fence and netting projects in the Western Hemisphere, physically pinning the snowpack to the slope before it ever gets the chance to slide. Nets instead of shells. Clear the mountain on your own schedule, and there's nothing left to fall on anyone when they aren't expecting it. And then there's the layer that would have saved Wellington outright if it had existed in 1910. Knowing the snow is unstable before anyone has to find out the hard way. BNSF, the modern freight railroad built from the wreckage of Great Northern's old network, runs a forecasting tool called the Railroad Avalanche Danger Scale, built to flag which slopes are approaching failure before a single flake moves. Along its most exposed stretches, the railroad has strung networks of tilt-sensitive posts planted between the track and known slide paths. If an avalanche knocks one over, it radios an alarm to the control center before the snow has even finished falling. A pole tips, a signal fires, dispatch knows before the debris settles. Newer accelerometer-based systems, already running on 4 separate major North American railroads, trip the instant a slide's shockwave hits the ground and alert dispatchers automatically, so a train still miles away can be held instead of sent straight into a buried curve. Engineers are testing LiDAR scanners and buried fiber optic cable along some corridors too, hunting for debris on the rails before a locomotive ever reaches it, and trialing solar-powered cameras that let a controller check a slide in real time from an office hundreds of miles away, instead of sending a crew in blind. And on the handful of slopes the railroad considers too dangerous to simply monitor, Crews use a device nicknamed the Daisy Bell, a helicopter-slung unit that fires precisely timed blasts of sound and shockwaves straight into the snowpack, triggering a controlled release on the railroad's own terms instead of the mountains. None of that engineering runs on autopilot either. Every one of those systems still needs a human being to read the forecast, decide the risk is real, and actually close the line before a train gets sent into it. And that judgment call has failed before. Railroads across North America and the Alps still report avalanches reaching active track most winters, usually minor slides that a plow clears in an afternoon, occasionally something bigger that shuts a corridor down for days while crews assess whether the slope above it is done moving. The difference from 1,910 isn't that the snow stopped falling, it's that almost nobody is standing underneath it anymore when it does. None of it makes the mountains safe. Avalanches still hit railroads every winter. They still block lines, still bury switches, still occasionally catch someone who shouldn't have been standing where they were. What's changed is that nearly every disaster on the scale of Wellington happened before 1930. Tunnels moved trains out from under the worst slopes entirely. Deliberate, scheduled avalanches took the surprise out of the ones that couldn't be avoided. And a century of sensors, forecasting, and expensive, hard-earned engineering turned a mountain that used to strike without warning into one that mostly announces itself first. It took 96 lives at Wellington and 58 more at Rogers Pass in the same single week, before two entire railroads agreed the old way of crossing a mountain simply wasn't good enough anymore. Nobody chose that price. It just turned out to be what it cost to learn the lesson the hard way. Every tunnel bored since, every sensor strung along an exposed grade, every scheduled blast fired into a slope before it can pick its own moment, traces straight back to that 1 week in March. So the next time you watch a train roll calmly through snow country, like the mountain above it couldn't end it in 30 seconds, remember that calm was paid for. 154 people bought it, and the railroads spent the next century making sure the bill never came due again. The mountain hasn't gotten any less dangerous. The trains just stopped giving it the chance.